Good morning, and thank you for joining us today. I'm Alvaro Santos, professor of law at Georgetown University and faculty director of CAROLA, the Center for the Advancement of the Rule of Law in the Americas. Welcome to our fourth Career Paths session in our fall series, The Americas in Times of COVID-19. Our session today is on immigration law and policy, and we have a wonderful lineup of speakers who I'll introduce in a moment. The goal of this career path session is to present students and recent law graduates with different perspectives, ranging from public, private, nonprofit, and academic in a substantive field of the legal profession. We would like aspiring lawyers to learn from successful experiences and also appreciate how exciting, varied, and sometimes non-linear careers may be. On the topic of today, we have seen increasing concerns about immigration policies in the United States with the rise of anti-immigrant and xenophobic rhetoric. This is true also in other countries. Economic crisis, violence, and natural disasters, often precipitated by climate change, have forced people to move outside their home countries. And we're very concerned about this phenomenon in the Americas, in our hemisphere. We had a webinar on Tuesday discussing migration trends in the region, the situation at the US-Mexico border, the machinery of immigration predicated on enforcement and criminalization that long predates the Trump administration, and what is at stake in the next week's presidential elections. These concerns about immigration have become ever more urgent now in times of COVID-19. And today we have a wonderful group of speakers who will be able to broaden our lens about what careers might be available for people interested in this field, share with us their insights about what work they've done to try to improve the welfare and well-being of immigrants and refugees in the United States and the work that they've been doing in the US or more broadly in the Americas. So I'll very briefly introduce our speakers because they'll have a chance to tell us more about themselves in the Q&A questions. So first we have Jill Marie Bussey, who is at the Catholic Legal Immigration Network. Next we have Giulia McPherson at the Jesuit Refugee Service. Then we have Sarah Pierce at the Migration Policy Institute. And finally, Aaron Reichlin-Melnick at the American Immigration Council. And so in terms of format, we're going to run this session as a conversation where I'll pose some questions and give each panelist a chance to respond. So this way, we're going to have first these rounds of questions, and then we will open up the discussion for questions from you, the audience. And so when we get to that part, what I'll ask you is to raise your hand using the function in Zoom, and I'll call on you so that you can pose your question. We will also ask you to turn on your videos so that speakers can see you and we can see who is accompanying us today. Okay, so let's start with the first question. So I'd like the speakers to tell us what their current job is and the kind of work they're currently engaged in. And we will start with Jill. And thank you again to our speakers for joining us today. We're really delighted to have you and very grateful that you're taking time of your busy schedules to be with us.
Thank you, Alvaro. My name is Jill Marie Bussey, and I'm the Director of Advocacy at the Catholic Legal Immigration Network, Inc., or CLINIC, which is in DC. We're the town of acronyms, so our acronym CLINIC is more familiar, I think, to most people. I am an immigration attorney with over 22 years of experience in immigration law. and over 5 years of experience as a national level advocate. And I'm very grateful to be with you today and for this opportunity to talk more about our work at Clinic. We were founded by the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops over 30 years ago as an independent nonprofit organization. Our mission is to embrace the core gospel value of welcoming the stranger. And we do, our work is to promote the dignity and protect the rights of immigrants in partnership with a network of 380 organizations throughout the United States that provide direct legal services to immigrants. And those organizations serve over 400,000 immigrants every year. It is the largest network of its kind. And my role at Clinic is to advocate for the rights of those, both the programs, the agencies themselves, and the clients that they serve. We do that through administrative advocacy. We focus on administrative advocacy at Clinic, and we defer to our legislative partner, the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops, in terms of legislative advocacy. And so each year we develop a priority of issues that we will advocate for or to try to defend in this current environment. And we're currently in the process of developing those priorities for 2021. I can, with the various things that the outcomes of the election could really change what we do next year. So it's an interesting time to try to plan for that. And Alvaro, I'll leave it at that. And I'm looking forward to the rest of our discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Jill. Let me now move to Giulia.
Great. Hi, everyone. Thank you, Alvaro. Thanks again for inviting me today. So my name is Giulia McPherson. I'm the Director of Advocacy and Operations at Jesuit Refugee Service USA. We are an international Catholic humanitarian organization founded by the Jesuits 40 years ago. We're actually celebrating our 40th anniversary next month. And we were founded by Father Pedro Arrupe, who was at that point the Superior General of the Jesuits. And he was witnessing the plight of the Vietnamese boat people at the end of the Vietnam War, and put a call out to his fellow Jesuits to say, the Jesuits are meant to work on the margins of society, to work with the most vulnerable. And from his perspective, refugees were the most vulnerable people at that time. And that was really the beginning of JRS. And, arguably refugees today are still disproportionately impacted by conflict and crisis. There are almost 80 million refugees and forcibly displaced people around the world. So our mission is even more relevant today. We're operating in about 56 different countries around the world. Our office here in Washington is one of 10 regional JRS offices. So we are both a North America regional office partnering with our colleagues in Canada, and then we're also a JRS USA country office. So we have one domestic program that we're currently running here in the US. It's actually a detention chaplaincy program. It's a grant that we have from the Department of Homeland Security to place a chaplain in 5 different federal detention centers. And they offer religious services, religious accommodations to detainees of any faith background. So that's one domestic program that we have running right now. We're actually in the process of launching a new domestic program, which I can talk more about as we continue the conversation at the border, the southern border. But the majority of the work that we're doing out of this office and globally is to serve refugees where they are, both if they're internally displaced in their home country or if they are in a host country. So through our work in those 56 countries, we offer legal representation, which we'll definitely talk more about today. We also run programs focused on education and livelihoods, mental health and psychosocial support, and then advocacy. And so the role that I play here at JRS USA is focused on advocacy, and we really focus specifically on engaging with the US government, both the administration and Congress, to advance the rights of refugees. So it focuses on US policy related to refugees, both here within our borders and outside of our borders. So talking about humanitarian assistance, and then also looking at the funding levels that the US government budgets for in terms of providing humanitarian assistance overseas to refugees. And then depending on sort of what's happening given any given day, we'll focus specifically on country-specific or regional-specific issues as well, depending on what's happening and where JRS USA is best positioned to kind of inform that conversation, really leaning heavily on our field experience and our field presence in the countries where we operate.
Thank you, Giulia. Let's now move to Sarah.
Hi, thanks so much for having me. So again, my name is Sarah Pierce. I work for the Migration Policy Institute, or MPI. MPI is a bipartisan think tank that studies the movement of people worldwide. I specifically work in our US immigration policy program. And at MPI, as this nonpartisan organization, we're looking to advocate or at least push out policies and analysis on how we can improve migration systems for both the migrants and the receiving communities. So within the US immigration program, we're a small program, a small team. I'm one of 2 attorneys on the program, and my role boils down to 3 really daily activities. The first is answering questions from stakeholders, whether that be individuals in Congress, other individuals in the field, the press, the public even, et cetera, to try to add context and analysis to the quick moving environment that we all live in and work in right now. The second thing is usually short term, but some shorter works, but sometimes longer works that react and provide analysis and context to things that are happening. So for example, today we'll be publishing a piece that looks at what interior enforcement might look like under a Trump administration versus a second Trump term, that is, versus a Biden administration. We also published a longer report this summer that actually is a catalog of all of the immigration-related changes that happened under the Trump administration. So things like that just provide context and help everyone understand a little better about what is happening and why it's happening and what the effects of those are. Then the third thing that I work on are longer term pieces that would actually provide policy recommendations for changes that we think would improve migration systems. So for example, I'm working on a piece right now with recommendations for how to improve the immigration court system. We're interviewing many stakeholders, both in and outside of the government, for ideas on solving the many problems that currently exist with our immigration courts.
Thank you, Sarah. Let us now move to Aaron.
Thank you, Alvaro. So I am a policy counsel at the American Immigration Council. In my role, a lot of what I do is most similar to what Sarah does on a day-to-day basis. Both of us work at think tanks in Washington, D.C., who focus on policy and bringing facts to the debate. And I think that latter thing is mostly what I do on a day-to-day basis, is ensuring that the public and as well as members of Congress and the media understands exactly what's going on in the world of immigration policy, what is happening with a blizzard of new policies coming down the pike every single day, and taking that information and synthesizing the complex immigration system into something that's understandable for the general public and for stakeholders. The American Immigration Council itself, where I work, is a bit of an odd organization in that we do a little bit of everything. We are an organization that was originally founded about 30 years ago as an arm, at first as an arm of the American Immigration Lawyers Association, but we are very much an independent organization. We do everything from helping coordinate pro bono representation for immigrants held in detention centers. We sue the government to try to produce systematic change in the immigration court system and to bring due process to the border and to all aspects of the immigration system. We use facts and communication strategies to change hearts and minds on the issue of immigration, to better educate people about the contributions that immigrants make to this country. And we also host a exchange worker program through J visas to help connect American businesses with the global market of ideas and innovation. My day-to-day work is mostly in the aspect of education and working with the public, but we also do a number of long-form reports like Sarah's as well. For instance, we worked this year to publish a comprehensive report documenting every single change made to the immigration system as a result of COVID-19, documenting everything that was big and small that was done from March through September. And just that ended up being, I think, a 40-page report. So it is difficult keeping track of everything that's happening. And my job is mostly to make sure that we all know what is happening.
Thank you, Aaron. So I'm going to move now to the second question. And here what we'd like to ask you is, give us your perspective of what you think are some of the most important challenges or changes in the field of immigration law and policy. I realize this is a huge question given all that's going on, but maybe you can help us zero in a little bit for our audience on a new development in the practice or an area that you think is ripe for reform, or a problem that you think is overlooked or underappreciated, an idea that you think is promising. Anything you'd like to share with us in this regard that you think, oh, we should be thinking about this and it's probably not very much in the debate, or maybe there is this issue that you're excited about and you want to share with us. So let's go to Jill first.
Yes, thank you. So I would like to say that I started out in immigration in 1998 and as a paralegal, and I went to law school later during 9/11. My first year of law school, 9/11 happened, and at that time there had been significant changes to the immigration system because of the reorganization of INS and the development of Department of Homeland Security, various laws and policies that stemmed from that terrorist event in our country. But I can tell you that, and so I was a law clerk during that time and very much still involved in immigration law. During that time, I try to compare that to the Trump administration, and I can say that it just doesn't compare. I've never seen anything like the rapid fire change of immigration law and policy under this administration. In my experience in my career in immigration law, I've never seen anything like it. And I think one of the great challenges that we have is the sheer volume. Is very difficult. Sarah and Aaron have talked about trying to catalog the tremendous amount of policy change that has occurred, just trying to keep up with it ourselves as a leading trainer on immigration law. Clinic is a leading trainer, and we have to try to train practitioners on what these changes mean for their clients. It has been extremely difficult to keep pace with the changes, but also it has been extremely challenging to maintain what I would consider the energy and enthusiasm for the work as we see how absolutely devoid of morality many of these policies just are, right there, and how they lack legal foundation. So many times the policies just shock the census and baffle our minds, and particularly the changes that we've seen to the asylum system and the direct human harm that we see as a result. It can be challenging to move through those times and stay focused on our mission to defend and protect the rights of individuals who are seeking safety at our shores. We talk a lot about self-care at Clinic because it has been a difficult 4 years to be an immigrant advocate. And of course, it's been a very difficult 4 years to be an immigrant or someone who is seeking safety. And so I think that's what calls us to our work and keeps us motivated, is knowing that there is human life and human dignity involved. So one thing that so that's the bleak picture. But one thing that I find, because I think ultimately a positive individual who likes to see hope in situations, one of the things that I think is exciting is to think about potential administration change. We'll see what happens next week, but this Trump administration has really laid bare many flaws that were already present in the immigration system, and how those issues have been utilized, and how agencies have been weaponized to carry out these policies. And it has really exposed these weaknesses, if you will, in the system, that we will then have the opportunity to work with a new administration to make structural change. And that's what excites me, is we're not just looking at turning light switches back on and reversing policy. What excites me is the idea of transforming our immigration system to what it really could be. The promise of that is what really keeps me waking up with a great deal of energy every morning. And I really do hope that we see a more just and humane system in our near future.
Thank you, Jill, for sharing that important perspective and also drawing our attention to this aspect of what it means and entails being an immigration lawyer and advocate that has this, really important human side and the struggle that you're describing. I think it's a really important reminder. Let me move now to Giulia.
I thought I would share a bit about our collaboration with our colleagues in Mexico. So JRS Mexico began operations in the 90s. We were working with Guatemalan refugees. And then that work tapered off a bit, and we actually closed that office. But back in 2017 now, 3 years ago, we were approached by UNHCR, the UN Refugee Agency, to consider reopening our office and beginning programming again. Because what we were seeing at that point was an influx of migrants and refugees making their way through Mexico, primarily from Central America and the Northern Triangle of Central America, but also other migration flows from the Caribbean, Haiti, Cuba, from sub-Saharan Africa. The migration flows were getting more complex and more diverse and larger in numbers. So we actually restarted our program, and our primary office in Mexico is in southern Mexico near the Guatemala border. And we employ both lawyers and psychosocial assistants, so psychologists, but then also staff who are able to manage or provide psychosocial assistance to our partners. And what we've seen evolve over the past couple of years is the number of people that we're serving has increased dramatically, but most significantly, I think we're all aware of, but wanted to share a bit about one of the new Trump policies that was enacted in January 2019, so almost 2 years ago, the Remain in Mexico policy, the migrant protection protocols. And once that policy was put in place where asylum seekers were turned back to Mexico, we really saw the numbers of people that we were serving escalate. And in particular, when we started seeing some of those asylum seekers being taken from the Mexico's northern border, so the US southern border, down to southern Mexico, so closer to where JRS has its office, we started seeing more and more migrants and refugees needing assistance. And so our work really became even more relevant at that point. I was actually in Mexico at that office this past January, almost a year ago, and was able to meet with our legal team, able to meet with some of the migrants and refugees that we were assisting. And it was really fascinating, to hear some of the stories. I mean, these are very compelling, some of the most compelling stories that I've heard, and I've traveled to a number of JRS countries around the world, but some of the most compelling stories of violence and persecution that these asylum seekers were presenting. And they understood, and their sense was that they didn't even have the ability, there was no opportunity to go to the US. So they were trying to seek asylum or petition for asylum in Mexico. And so the need for our legal team to ramp up its work, to increase its work. At that point, we were looking to bring on more lawyers, became ever more critical. So I think this question of this policy, the impact it's had on migration flows, on the capacity of countries like Mexico to absorb the need of asylum seekers who are arriving in their country, and then looking ahead, similar to what Jill Marie was saying about what the new year might bring for us. If there's a reverse in policy, what might that mean in terms of what we'll see happening at our southern border? Will we need additional legal assistance on the US side? I think probably likely so. We're actually looking at ways to provide more provide legal assistance on the Mexico's northern border, since we don't currently have a presence there, but there are so many waiting in limbo, waiting for assistance, and access to legal representation is so limited that we'd like to try to provide as much as possible. So I think this bigger question of just access to legal representation for asylum seekers is a huge one. And then physically, where we're seeing asylum seekers, where are they physically located, and how that might evolve over the next months is really something that I think we're keeping an eye on.
Thank you, Giulia. Let me now move to Sarah.
Yeah, so as Giulia and Jill indicated, a lot rides on next week as far as what the future will hold. For what is exciting and what is happening in this field. If we have a second Trump term, I think we're going to expect a lot of the same as far as this fast-paced litany of changes on immigration. I think in a second Trump term, we would see a lot more on interior enforcement, as well as some initiatives that might not have been politically popular during a first term. If instead we have a Biden administration, there's going to be a lot of focus on undoing everything that happened under Trump. But as Jill indicated too, I think there's a lot of momentum around broader reforms. I think the challenge with a Biden administration is that immigration wouldn't be the top policy priority. It was the top, or has been the top policy priority under a Trump administration. And that's why we've seen such a fast-paced change. And I think I'd be surprised if it was in the top 5, but I might be, a little overly skeptical. But without all of that momentum around immigration, it's hard to picture how that undoing and how maybe a larger rethinking of immigration would work under Biden, or how fast it might be accomplished. So that's kind of the broad overview, but I think, what's especially relevant to law students, and regardless of which administration we have come January, is the broad momentum around representation in immigration, which is something Giulia indicated as well. I think if we have another Trump administration, we're going to see a continued push for representation at the local level. That's something we already saw during the Trump administrations. A lot of organizations and even like local community groups really pulling together to gather funding to allow immigrants to be represented. And I would definitely expect that momentum to continue and really increase in a second Trump term, especially if we see a big push on interior enforcement. Because as anyone who works in immigration will tell you, having representation when you're in removal proceedings is vital. Immigration law is so complicated. It's so hard to navigate without representation. So having representation both for people in removal proceedings and of course asylum seekers, I think is vital, and it's something that people are increasingly aware of. And then if Instead, there's a Biden administration. What I hope to see is some top-down efforts on representation, something, coming from the federal level that would mandate or at least fund more representation at a local level. So I think from the perspective of a law student, that's a really exciting movement in the field going forward.
Thank you, Sarah. Let me now ask Aaron.
Yeah, it's hard to go after everyone has given such really incredible answers already on this. So I want to sort of focus on some of the bigger picture stuff. I think my view of the question was sort of what's the exciting things to look at is, should we have a new administration? I think that there's a lot of people who are recognizing that small incremental changes are no longer necessary or the only way to respond, and that the system is fundamentally flawed in so many ways, flawed in ways that Congress created, flawed in ways that immigration regulations created, flawed in simply a matter of resources, that we need large-scale systematic change is going to fix a system that everyone acknowledges is in dire need of an upgrade. And the easiest way to think about this is, for instance, just the immigration court backlog itself. There are 1.2 million cases and growing that are currently pending in immigration court in front of about 450 judges, which means thousands of cases per judge, and leading to immigration cases being scheduled 4 or 5 years in the future because there just simply isn't enough resources. And while comprehensive immigration reform is something that could potentially fix this, we have to be looking at bigger solutions, because there will be another situation with people arriving at our border and seeking protection, and we need to take bold, decisive choices at the border and inside the country in order to address what the future is going to look like. As much as this administration wants to say it, you can't just build up a wall and stop people from coming. I often say the only way that the United States will stop being a being a place where people try to come is if we eliminate that so-called beacon of light that brings people here. And as terrible as things may have gotten in immigration over the last few years, I don't think we're anywhere near that point. The people arriving on our borders still see America as a land of opportunity, and it will take a lot worse than what's happened over the last 4 years to make people stop thinking that. So we know we can't deter our way out of this. We can't increase the cruelty at the border and stop people from coming. Not only does it attack our sort of sense of justice as a country and a nation, but we also have to think about how to process people at the border in a humane and effective way, ensure people don't have to wait 5 years to find out whether they're granted asylum, and fundamentally rethink the immigration system inside the United States. Deportation and harsh penalties for often minor crimes or simply minor violations of immigration status. So I'm comfortable thinking that the next few years could bring with it some actual serious systemic change. While that may not come through Congress, I hope that the advocates that are here, and I know we are all going to keep working no matter who's the president, to push for those changes in the next 4 years.
Thank you, Aaron. And what I really appreciate is the way in which your views have complemented each other, but also the insights that you're sharing with the audience, both about detailed analysis of what's needed on the ground in terms of legal representation and how that can help asylum seekers or immigrants, but at the same time, the view that that's really limited if you have a structure or a system that makes it so hard to make real impact or real changes. And so you're moving up to an analysis of the policies that have been in place, many of them by this administration, but also have predated this administration. And so it offers our audience, I think, a really good understanding of how an advocate and someone interested in pursuing this career needs to have a view of both worlds, the tree, so to speak, but also the forest. So how to navigate between the on-the-ground knowledge and advocacy, but at the same time, the policy view of what needs to change more broadly. And so I think that became really clear your participations. Let me now move to the third question, and so we're going to change gears a little bit and ask you to share more about your own trajectory. And so here, what I'd like to ask you is, how did you end up where you are now, and what lessons or insights have you gathered along the way in your career? So share a bit more of your own personal journey with our audience. And let's start again with Jill.
Thank you, Alvaro. Yes, as I mentioned, I started off in immigration as a paralegal. I knew that I wanted to be a lawyer since I was a very young girl, and I tried out different areas of law as a paralegal, and I had this beautiful experience of finding a mentor early on in my career. Her name is Reichlin-Melnick, and she is a wonderful, talented immigration attorney and philanthropist. And she's remained a mentor to me for these years, since 1998. And so when I knew that I wanted to pursue immigration law as an attorney, I went to law school with that in mind. I sought clinical experience. And as I mentioned, I clerked through my law school career back at the law firms that employed me previously as a paralegal. So then I went into corporate immigration law, and I practiced corporate immigration law for 15 plus years at the world's largest law firm. And I had the tremendous opportunity of being part of this huge global law firm and representing corporate clients that are moving their workforces, not just into the United States, but across borders. So my practice was global immigration. And if you are a comparative law junkie like I am, it really allowed me to compare US immigration law to the laws in Singapore, to the laws in Australia. It was really an exciting time to just learn about how other countries build their immigration systems and the perspectives that those countries have on immigration. So it was a lovely experience. But also during that time that I was, working 80 hours a week at a law firm, I also served on the board of directors of a very local nonprofit organization here where I live in Howard County called FERN, which is Foreign Born Information Referral Network. And it was a direct legal services provider and social service provider to immigrants right in my community. And I was able to be on this board and advocate for that organization and contribute to the growth of that organization and advocate for the immigrants that it served by holding special naturalization ceremonies and seeking policy within our own community to change and to be more welcoming of immigrants in our community. And so I found myself gravitating more towards the volunteer board work and the policy work. And so about 5 or 6 years ago, I guess it was about 6 years ago, I did some soul searching, and I would say that happened after I paid off my law school debt. And that I really decided that, and I don't think it was my decision, I believe the Holy Spirit moved and the Lord has called me to make a career change. And that is when I started working at Clinic. It was during the time that DACA was being implemented. It was a newer program. We were looking to make change and expand to DAPA. And it was a very positive, beautiful time to work in more of an affirmative, positive environment. And I would say what I've learned very quickly is mentorship. Having a strong role model, a mentor has meant the world to me, and now becoming a mentor to others is something that I take very seriously. And I think that it's very important to have those mentors and role models, particularly as a female attorney. I think it's been wonderful to have a woman such as Sheila as a mentor for so many years.
Thank you, Jill. So I know that Sarah is going to have to go to another meeting soon, so I'm going to now ask her to share her trajectory.
Thanks. And yeah, I'm very sorry to have to leave this early, especially it's so good to hear such interesting insights from my impressive colleagues in this field. So my trajectory, I graduated college in 2008, and like many graduates in 2008 at the Great Recession, went straight to graduate school. I knew that I wanted to be an attorney. I did not know what type of attorney I wanted to be. I knew I wanted to focus more on public interest. So I was in law school, and I spoke a little bit of Spanish, ended up doing a lot of volunteering for immigration-related projects, and then worked, rather than be a student, I was a legal assistant working in our clinic at law school for a professor named Barbara Schwartz, who was at the University of Iowa at the time, and has had a very impressive career in immigration. So I learned a lot from Professor Schwartz, really loved my time working in immigration, but then graduated law school in 2011, which was a very bad year to graduate as an attorney. That none of my classmates were hired. So, I can't pretend to understand what it's like to go to law school during a pandemic, but I can say I survived graduating law school and taking the bar without a job. And it was very difficult for my classmates and I, but everyone I know has ended up in careers that they love. It just might have taken a little longer and been a little more windy than any of us expected. So I got really lucky. I took the bar in Illinois. I volunteered at NIJC, National Immigrant Justice Center, while I was taking the bar, and afterwards. I also worked for a development consultant to make money on the side. It's very easy to be creative. Well, I shouldn't say easy, but it helped to be creative with how I was going to spend my time while looking for a job. And then I ended up at a law firm in Chicago, a smaller immigration firm. We had 10 attorneys. It's now called Kempster, Corcoran, Quiseno, and Lenz Calvo. And it is a very high volume law firm working in immigration. There were 10 attorneys, but I think 30 legal assistants. And because immigration is not an area where you can make a lot of money very easily, especially if the firm is entirely focused on immigration. So the setup of that firm was just to move through as many immigration cases as we could, as quickly as we could. I was on the employment-based team. I think 60% of my workload was employment-based cases. And then the rest were mostly family-based. I did a little bit of removal as well. And it was an amazing education on immigration. I was touching 20 to 30 cases a day, working as quickly as possible as I could on those cases. And I learned a lot and I loved it. It is a super interesting area to work in, but it's also very exhausting. And I know that the last question is on advice. And since I won't be able to be here for this, that's actually one of my biggest career advice, is to think about your personality when thinking about the job. And I know that as a student, you might not have that luxury to pick and choose a job based on your personality and work type, but it's definitely something to think about down the line, because I'm a little more introverted and I just had trouble removing myself from those cases. And I so admire immigration attorneys that are still in the field working day in and day out, because they're very difficult cases, even on the employment-based side where it's not a life and death situation for the clients, it's still their lives. It's a very big deal whether or not they're able to immigrate. And US immigration law is very difficult. It does not work in the immigrant's favor much of the time, and they can be really upset. And as the attorney, you're kind of the sounding board can be the sounding board for that. So I loved the work. It was very exhausting. And I think just part of me knew that it was not a perfect fit. So after a few years, I set out to do a career change, and I was still a young professional. I was still only a few years out from law school, so that wasn't the easiest prospect. But I started applying for jobs, and I told myself that if I didn't get a job by a certain amount of time, I would actually go back to school and complete a master's program in international affairs, because I was thinking about focusing a little more internationally. So I applied for a few jobs, got close, but didn't end up finding another one. Ended up choosing the master's program at GW because that enabled me to go to school full-time at night while working during the day. Because I think the single best thing about being a student is interning and working at as many organizations as possible. It's the best way to meet people. It's the best way to get a sense of what you want to do and where you want to be in the field and what the options are out there. Because you can and you should do informational interviews, but actually working at the places is such a more valuable experience. So I moved from Chicago to DC in 2014, I think, and ended up, one of my internships was at the Migration Policy Institute. And I think I applied for an internship on our international team, and they were like, an immigration attorney, great, like, let's stick her on the US team. And I'm so grateful they did, because I ended up, loving the work. And obviously I'm still at MPI today. So yeah, that's a little bit of my trajectory. And the biggest lessons: stay flexible, which I know all of you don't have a choice with that because you are students during a pandemic, but stay flexible, stay creative, and stay true to your personality. The job I'm working now, it's not an ideal job for a very introverted person. Like today I have 2 webinars, 2 radio interviews, and 2 press interviews, but this type of work works much better for my personality. I'm not as drained as I was as an immigration attorney. I feel like I'm making good change. It's not as directly awarding as it is doing direct service. There was something amazing and magical about walking out with clients after a successful interview and seeing their cases through to a successful end. And I'm jealous that attorneys on the ground still get that reward, but I really love my job and find it very rewarding every day. And I'm so grateful that I took that risk early on in my career to make a big change, even though I was very happy as a practicing attorney. So listen to your gut, stay flexible, stay creative, and good luck. And please reach out if you have any questions. My email address is spierce, SPIERCE, @migrationpolicy.org. I'm always happy to answer questions because I know just how difficult this time in your lives can be. But this is an amazing field with so many varied options. I definitely recommend diving in if you're interested.
Thank you so much, Sarah, for sharing your trajectory, but also anticipating our last question and sharing your advice. That was great. And I know you have to go. Thank you for joining us today. It's been really great.
Thank you very much. Good luck.
Thank you. So now let me move to Giulia to hear about your trajectory.
Thank you. So I'm a bit of an anomaly on this panel in that I am not a lawyer and I do not have a law degree, but I'm happy to share a bit about how I arrived, where I am in terms of my current role at JRS, and maybe even to talk a bit about how counsel that we have on staff around the world, sort of arrive at working at an operational organization, humanitarian organization like JRS. So I did study political science as an undergrad, but was always particularly interested in international affairs and international development in particular. I was curious about human rights issues, volunteered, and did any kind of internship I could in the international space. So after undergrad, I went to graduate school at George Washington as well. I completed their program in international development studies with a focus on humanitarian assistance. So my goal was actually to start in programs. I wanted to be a program implementer. I wanted to go out to the field and focus on humanitarian assistance programs. And so after graduate school, I did that. I went overseas, And it was a fantastic opportunity, a great experience. I was able to finally, put into practice the issues that I had studied and the work that I was so passionate about. But then I also realized that just personally, a life abroad wasn't what I had hoped for or intended to sort of pursue in the long term. And that's really the reality of a lot of individuals, who work for international humanitarian organizations overseas, including those who work for JRS, where oftentimes, those are very specific skills, and you have to be a very, very open, have a very open personality and flexible personality to be able to work in very difficult circumstances. And so I knew that while it was a great learning experience, I didn't necessarily want that for myself in the long term. So I came back to the US and actually was able to get a job at a large international humanitarian organization called CARE. And I worked for CARE for about 11 years. And I was with CARE at their Washington office, which at that point and currently in many ways focused primarily on advocacy. And for me, as someone who had lived abroad, who went to graduate school for international development, the linkage between programs and advocacy was never quite clear to me. Those dots weren't connected at any point, but being able to see that firsthand at CARE about how important it is to advocate on issues and how complementary that is to actually delivering those services on the ground. So absolutely delivering services, working closely with people, making sure that they have access to legal representation, access to education, other humanitarian sort of basic needs is important, and we impact people's lives every day. But looking at the sort of macro challenges that cause some of the issues that refugees in our case now at JRS face is just as important. Speaking out on behalf of policies that could impact thousands, if not millions of people, in addition to those that we impact on a day-to-day basis, is just as critical to our mission statement. So that case was made for me in the first part of my career, and I switched over to JRS about 5 years ago, working specifically now in this refugee space, which has been fascinating. I started at JRS in 2015. Just at the beginning of the quote unquote sort of refugee crisis, where we were seeing thousands of refugees fleeing South Asia and the Middle East into Europe, and it was grabbing people's attention. Where certainly those of us working in the field or who had preceded me in this field, knew that this was a challenge. But we've been seeing numbers of refugees just increase year over year. And so, like I mentioned earlier, it's even more relevant today to be working in this field. But the mission statement of really aligning our programmatic work with our advocacy work is so clear. I mean, our sort of mission statement as an organization is to accompany, serve, and advocate on behalf of refugees. So we really see advocacy and service going hand in hand. So I would just say that for me now, it's sort of a day-to-day basis, the importance of advocating for these issues is something that I see every day when we hear from our colleagues, if it's in Bangladesh working with the Rohingya, or if it's in Mexico working with migrants in Mexico, about encouraging the US government to really take a stand on some of these issues, to implement policies that will positively have an impact on refugees' lives, to use diplomatic channels, with other governments to make the case for some of these policies. It's just so critical. And those of us in the US have such an important role to play. And hopefully in the future, we'll continue to have an important role to play on these issues. So I would say that, so from that advocacy perspective, it's such an important area of work to be involved in. And just quickly, in terms of providing those direct legal services in the countries where we work, I mentioned certainly Mexico, and we employ Mexican lawyers to offer those services to asylum seekers who come to JRS's door. They provide intake and assess the vulnerability of that migrant refugee And we have, limited capacity, but they try to take as many cases on as possible, but certainly try to target the most vulnerable. And then in other places around the world, we do a fair amount of legal representation in European countries as well. In particular, I mentioned this sort of refugee crisis from a few years ago, where we saw larger numbers of migrants and refugees making their way to Europe, trying to seek asylum. So we've been able to employ counsel in many of our European countries as well to try to serve as many migrants and asylum seekers as possible in Europe. So I'll end there, but also happy to share some of my tidbits in terms of recommendations and tips in the next round.
Thank you, Giulia. Yes, we'll get to that in a moment. Now let me turn to Aaron.
Thank you all. And again, it's really hard following everybody's really fascinating and interesting backgrounds. I have the least experience, I think, of anyone on this call, so it's interesting, but I have a very varied one. I have been in the field of immigration law for 6 years now. I'm a 2014 graduate, and I have worked at 2 organizations during that time. Like many of the students, I was interested in immigration during my time at Georgetown. I did the CALS clinic where I represented an asylum seeker, and I volunteered during the year at the CARE Coalition in downtown DC. But I was also interested in working as a public defender, and my 1L and 2L summer jobs were working with public defenders in Maryland. And when I left law school, when I was planning, in my 3L year looking for jobs, I wasn't hunting for only immigration jobs. I was hunting for public defender jobs as well. I was very fortunate enough to become one of the first class of the Immigrant Justice Corps, something that many of you, it's a fellowship that many of you may know, that takes 25 new immigration lawyers a year to represent people in immigration courts in New York and now around the nation. And so for 2 years out of law school, I worked as a removal defense attorney in New York City for the Legal Aid Society, representing people who primarily had been placed in immigration court because the government wanted to deport them due to a prior criminal conviction. I did this work for 2 years. I loved it. It was incredible work. It was surrounded by a team of bright, talented, and experienced immigration lawyers who taught me an enormous amount in a short period of time. But then, like many people, other concerns came up, and my partner got a job in DC, and I decided that I was going to move back to DC to be with her, and I had to leave my job at the Legal Aid Society. I was fortunate enough to get a job at the American Immigration Council, and then for 2 years, I actually worked as a staff attorney doing impact litigation, doing some of that legal work that I mentioned at the beginning, helping sue the government to improve due process rights in immigration courts, at the border, and for asylum seekers. This was really fascinating, very different work that let me actually get into federal court and help draft motions to litigate and sort of try to work on the bigger structural issues that I had seen in my 2 years representing individual immigrants. But after 2 years in 2018, the job when I took it in 2016 before the election looked very different than the job that I had for most of the 2 years doing it, where we were in a defensive posture, really trying to defend a lot of the work that we had done over the previous years rather than push the bar forward. And I think 2 years into the Trump administration, I was getting a little frustrated because litigation is slow. You can file a lawsuit to stop something and you might not get in front of a judge for 6 months. And meanwhile, that policy is in effect the entire time, and you're sitting there feeling helpless because a motion is sitting in front of a judge and the judge just hasn't issued a decision yet. Now, I am hugely in favor of litigation, and I continue to support it in my current role. But I think after 2 years, especially it was the height of family separation, and I was getting a little disillusioned with the pace of litigation, and a position opened up internally to shift over into a policy role. And I took it, and it was a really different shift. And so for the past 2 years, I've been working on immigration policy and sort of becoming a bit of a jack of all trades on a lot of these things. Because I have this background of immigration court and impact litigation, which is a somewhat unusual combination. And now the shift over to work in the immigration policy space. And I think my experience there is a good example of how you really can end up in this in various different ways. There's so many different ways to get into immigration world. And I often think back to the fact that I almost didn't end up here at all. And I think this is a good way to say there's a fair amount of luck in ending up where he is. And it's not to say that I wouldn't be doing something different, but I didn't find out about the fellowship that I got in 2014 until a week before the application deadline closed. And unfortunately, if you haven't heard about it, the application deadline closes today, I believe, or may have closed yesterday for this year's class, but they do accept people, anyone who's a rising 3L or up to 1 year after graduating can still apply for the fellowship. But I didn't find out about it until 7 days before the application closed. And I was fortunate enough to get it, but there's a world out there where I'm a happy public defender doing what I think is equally important work, and hopefully still being able to help immigrants and help members of lesser served communities. But I think it's an important thing to always keep in mind. There is no one path to doing what you want to do. And unless you are the kind of person who has like a single-minded purpose, that there's only one thing in the world you want to do. And there are people like that. But I think I encourage people to sort of find different ways to think about, like, I look at my path and I say, it's a good way to know that you never really know where you're going to end up doing. If you had told me 6 years ago that I was going to be in Washington, D.C., taking media requests and talking to reporters and working on policy papers, I would have said you're out of your mind. And I think a lot of us have come here in different ways. And I think that's what my background, I feel like, shows. So I'll stop there and move on to the next. We can move on to the next.
Thank you, Aaron. It's a good reminder after listening to all of you of how experimental and also non-linear careers can be. And I think all of your trajectory shows a theme which has been trying to pursue what most interests you and what you're most passionate about, and also being flexible to take on risks and opportunities as you discover them. So let us move to the final question. And this is basically an opportunity for you to share advice that you have to our recent graduates and to students interested in this practice area. So what advice, if you can synthesize or decant some advice that you think helped you when you were launching your careers, or that you've basically gathered from your own experience, what would you recommend these aspiring lawyers? Jill, we're going to start with you again.
Thank you. I think the advice that I would offer is, similar to what I said before, is seek mentorship, become a mentor later on in life. I also think clinic experience during law school really changed my life. It was very important. And then subsequent internships and volunteer experiences, for me, really the volunteer experiences exposed me to different areas of immigration law that I would not have had the opportunity to experience in a very structured corporate practice. We didn't always do a tremendous amount of family-based law or family-based immigration law, or even a lot of naturalization. And so being able to volunteer for an organization, I volunteered through my local AILA chapter. The American Immigration Lawyers Association is a great bar association, and that kind of flows to my next recommendation is networking and bar association. But yeah, I think the volunteer internship experiences really helped shape me and help me find what I was most passionate about. As Alvaro said, I think it's very important to follow and pursue what you're going to love. You have to live with this every day of your life. So you better wake up. I say this to my team all the time. You better wake up enthusiastic and excited about what you're doing. Even in the Trump administration, which has been so oppressive and awful, every day I wake up and thank God for the opportunity to do what I'm able to do. as an advocate, and I do believe that in policy work we're doing the greater good type of work. And so, yeah, mentorship, volunteering, and internship to find out what really calls you, what speaks to your heart as a professional, and then networking and bar associations are so key to maintaining or developing your network. Number one, it's always wonderful to, when we used to be able to go to AILA chapter dinner meetings with each other and spend time with each other and benchmark on what this judge did and what that judge's preferences were, or what the service center was doing in immigration, and just practice. I had my own law practice for a while, so just sharing practice tips with each other, and potentially, if you do go into your own law practice, really ethically, you should have another law practice that you're partnered with in case something you need to refer out. But then that building that network and building that camaraderie. Every year going to this large conference of 5,000 immigration attorneys that are all together and sort of collectively seeking the education in the field, but also the experience of benchmarking and sharing and commiserating sometimes with each other. Those are my three tips, I guess. I'll leave it at that.
Great, excellent. Thank you, Jill. Let me turn to Giulia.
So my biggest piece of advice is really that flexibility piece. I mean, I mentioned that, I had a plan. I thought I knew after grad school where I wanted to be and what I wanted to do. And once I experienced that, I realized, okay, that wasn't quite the best fit. So I had to pivot. So being able to be flexible, and even though you think you might know exactly what you want to do, you have this path kind of in mind, just to be prepared that things happen. Not only might it not be what you expect it to be, but then life happens too. Your interests change. You might have personal issues that come up. We mentioned, a partner moving to another state, wanting to really maybe have something else, for yourself in your life. So to really just not be discouraged, I think, going hand in hand with that flexibility. So don't see it as a failure, or that it's you're delaying your career path, you're somehow wasting time. I think learn what you can from any position. I didn't mention this, but when I first came back after being abroad and got that position with CARE, it was a very entry-level position. It was far below what I thought I would get at that point in my career. And I was doing administrative work, but I knew that I got my foot in the door, and this was an organization that I believed in, and an organization that did work that I really was passionate about. So I was able to prove myself in that entry-level position, and then, was able to kind of progress to the next level. So just to keep in mind that if you do the work, if you demonstrate that you are reliable and able to accomplish what you're being asked of, or what's being asked of you, and that the organization begins to see you as being invaluable, then you'll certainly be able to kind of grow in that role and then within the organization. So just not to be discouraged as life kind of throws different kinds of challenges your way. That's inevitable. It's never going to go exactly the way that you planned it to go, but to hang in there, and ultimately, you'll be able to learn at least something from every experience that you have.
Thank you, Giulia. Let me turn to Aaron.
Yeah, I want to start by echoing both what Giulia and Jill said. Giulia's last point, that it's never going to go the way you intended it to go, is so true. And keep that in mind during the job search and in the first years of your career. It's again, you really don't know the number of people who are still at the same job they had right out of law school, working with the same organization, doing pretty much the same thing, is a really small number of people. It's very uncommon. And that's not a bad thing, because people grow and they change, and you don't necessarily know what you want to do. I also want to echo Jill's point about just volunteering and getting to know people and doing that work. I think many people, myself included, hate the idea of networking. And I just want to discouraged. I've always thought, stop thinking about networking and start thinking about just talking to people you find interesting and doing things that you think might be interesting. A lot of opportunities in my life have really come up just because I have raised my hand and said, sure, why not? I'd prefer to maybe sit at home and watch TV tonight, but I didn't have much else to do. And let me just give it a shot. Or said, you know what? I did have something else to do, but this seems like it's going to be more interesting than that, a higher priority, and doing it. But in really small things, like for instance, I chose as an Immigration Justice Corps fellow to be one of the first people to be sent down to family detention in 2015 as a pilot that our fellowship was doing. Because I was one of the first people down, I got to experience things that almost nobody else did, just a matter of luck and timing, because things changed on the ground after I got there. And that experience has taken with me through the rest of my career. And it's something that I come back to. It was 5 years ago, and something that happened in a single week of 5 years ago has to this day proven to be helpful to my career and helpful to my lawyering and my advocacy, just because I raised my hand and said, I'll take that chance. So if you get the opportunity to raise your hand and say, I'll take a chance, it's often right. And then I think I want to add something else here, which is unfortunate, a little bit of realism. All of us have survivorship bias. We are the ones who have had some success, and we've had that luck. There's a lot of people who are as talented as us, or more talented, harder workers than us, smarter than us, who know more than us, who for one various reason or another haven't managed to have that career work out. And it doesn't mean that they did anything wrong. It doesn't mean that there's something wrong with them. It's just the nature of the business, is that sometimes things don't work out. And I think that if things don't work out in your career, you should not take that out on yourself personally, especially if you want to go into nonprofit work. Nonprofit work is low paying, difficult, and hard to get. There are not many immigration nonprofits. There are way more than there were 10 years ago, to be clear, because in many ways, the Trump administration has been really great for funding, as well as the Obama administration as well, was really good for funding of immigration nonprofits. But that source of funding is not going to last forever. COVID-19 pandemic and recessionary concerns have already hit that. And a lot of organizations have hiring freezes going on right now because situations outside of their control. And there's a lot of people who just simply do the work for a few years and then burn out and go off and do something else. Of the 25 people who joined me in my first class as Immigrant Justice Corps Fellowship, a lot of them are still in immigration law. I am now friends with people who are supervising attorneys at organizations that they joined as initial fellows, as like the lowest person on the organizational chart, and they're now making their way up. They're managers, they're supervisors, and they're doing great work. And there's others who aren't doing immigration law anymore, who have split off and done something else. Some have opened their own immigration law firms as well, and not in doing nonprofit at all. And so out of that 25, you're seeing a wide variety of people doing a whole variety of different things, some in immigration, some not in immigration. And I think that just goes to show, when talking to us, and whenever you hear people like us talking, keep in mind that we are the ones who were lucky enough to do well. And I just always say this is, there's nothing wrong with you if you don't manage to have that luck. Sometimes it's just circumstances outside of your control. And I know that's a little depressing to say, but I think I treat that as a positive personally. It means that you control as much in your life as you control, and you have to acknowledge that sometimes there are, and I also show this, I found out I wasn't the first person offered my job at the American Immigration Council. I was the second person. The first person turned down the job offer. And to me, that's really helpful for me to know. That shows me that I have succeeded, even though I wasn't the first choice. And I think you should always keep that in mind. You can succeed even if you weren't the first choice. So I'll stop there and give you the questions.
All right, thank you, Aaron. So let me now open this up to our audience. And so I'll ask those of you who want to ask questions to just say your name, identify yourselves, and then ask your question. And you can do that using you can raise your hand in Zoom, or if you can't find that button, just use an emoticon and I'll see it in your screen and I can call on you. or raise your hand. I can also see you. Yes, Nora.
Hi, my name is Nora and I'm a Georgetown law student. So obviously there haven't been a lot of wins in the last 4 years, and doing big picture policy work, you don't get the kind of daily feedback of direct services. So I was wondering if you could talk about concrete ways that you've experienced your work making a difference that kind of keeps you motivated on a daily basis.
Do you want someone in particular to answer that question, or is that a question for the general panel?
I think anyone who's
interested. Okay. So who'd like to answer?
I can take a first stab, if that's okay.
Great.
I would say there haven't been a lot of wins, you're right. But one of the things that Clinic started working on very early on in the Trump administration, we understood quickly that the temporary protected status program was going to be under threat and direct threat under this administration. And so we started forming this coalition. It started coming together very organically of advocates who wanted to defend the protection that TPS provides. And so that coalition has grown and grown and grown, and we're bringing in organizations that are closest to the pain to this coalition. We now host an advocacy working group that focuses particularly on TPS policy, and the diversity of the group and the work that we have done and the commitment that I see in this coalition is some of, and I've met some of the most creative minds in this coalition. It helps you, I think, to avoid some of the groupthink that can happen within a single organization. To be in coalition, to have the opportunity to expand your thinking and really brainstorm and be creative on solutions. That to me has been some of the most gratifying work. Although we have not particularly been successful in terms of getting the Trump administration to understand the humanity, the human dignity of the individuals involved. I don't think we're going to change that heart or that mind. We have sent a very clear message to temporary protected status recipients and their families that there are people out there who love and care for them and are fighting for them, and we're going to keep fighting. And so that's where I find energy, positive energy, and great inspiration in my work.
Thank you, Jill. Let me see if I can pick up other questions. Or so I just got a question via chat about the availability of the session for watching later, and the answer is yes. This session is being recorded, and so if you arrive late, you can watch it later, and we will also publicize it for anyone who wants to watch it. We understand there are people who wanted to see the speakers but couldn't come because of a time conflict. All right, so let me see if there are other specific questions to the panelists. Or if one of the panelists want to add something to the previous question, we can do that too.
I had another piece to add to what Jill shared. So we have actually had some success, a fair amount of success with our work with Congress in particular. So not to forget that Congress is plays a critical role in developing policy and also in implementing policy and in making funding decisions. And so while there have been certainly challenges in trying to counter some of the administration's policies, we have seen Congress, for example, defeat some of the administration's budget proposals, where the administration has looked to cut significantly funding for humanitarian assistance programs, especially overseas humanitarian assistance programs, and Congress has fought back, both in a bipartisan way, fought back against those cuts. So I would say that there's hope in sort of our government structure in terms of co-equal branches of government, and that Congress is always an opportunity to sort of advocate on behalf of some of these issues. And I would also just mention that we still are able to impact individual lives as well. Again, when I was in Mexico earlier this year, one of the days I was there, one of our clients was a man from the DRC, Democratic Republic of Congo, who had tried to seek asylum in the US, was turned back and then sought asylum in Mexico. And his case was accepted. He was granted asylum the day that I was there. He had his final interview. And just to see his joy, and after having heard his horrendous story of what he had endured in his home country and on his journey, there are bright lights like that. So again, balancing those kind of individual success stories with some of the bigger kind of policy, budgetary advocacy wins that we can still have.
Yeah, and I want to add one really quick thing to that. And sometimes it's just about building on the future. This year, the House Democrats' budget proposal included the steepest reduction in detention levels in over 20 years. That was something that policy advocates, myself included, had been pushing for a very long time. And while that's certainly not the budget that's going to eventually be passed, because right now with the Senate split and President Trump in control, markers like that make a difference. And we've gotten consensus on issues around immigration detention that we never would have gotten before, because advocates have been pushing for years. And we are working now to build up to see what a post-Trump world would look like. And that policy doesn't get started on day one. We've been working for it for years. And so you can see some successes even if you don't actually make any change in what it's building the foundations for the future.
Thank you, Aaron. Lelia, did you have a question?
Yes, I did.
Great, go ahead.
For Giulia in particular, because she's the non-lawyer in the House, and I think that is actually very important, because this conversation, this field of practice is very multidisciplinary, and it requires, depending on which part, whether you are doing the practice in the front lines, in the trenches, or doing the policy work or the strategic work, you are all doing that type of playing those different key roles in your organizations that, by the way, are all mission driven. So there's a mission behind. So, but Giulia in particular, let's pretend that you have an opening in your team. You are the director of advocacy at JRS. And by the way, I had the opportunity to participate on one of those rounds with Congress, which is amazing, that you lead. So what are the skills? What would make you hire a lawyer on your team versus a non-lawyer? What are the knowledge? What are the skills? What is the expertise that would, make you hire a lawyer? And at the same time, what would prevent you from hiring a lawyer to bring into your team?
It's a great question. So when I actually started at JRS, I had worked previously, my advocacy work was focused more on sort of global development issues, and this more niche area space working on immigration, on refugee issues was entirely different. Even our partner organizations, other colleagues, it was a whole new set of individuals. And it became clear that a lot of my new colleagues and partners across other organizations did have legal backgrounds. And what I recognized was that it wasn't critical, necessary skill to have, a legal background, but it certainly did provide additional sort of information and a skill set that I couldn't bring to the table. So what I really saw as being the value add of having someone with a legal background was to really understand this complex system. Several of the panelists mentioned, immigration law is very complex. It took time for me to really come up to speed in terms of having a very even cursory understanding of all of the different legal kind of implications and systems that I had, no knowledge of ahead of time. So I would say that just understanding of how the systems work, who are the different players, how the systems intersect with one another, the history of immigration law, all of those pieces are so important to understanding where we are today and how you can best advocate for improving the current system. So that's, as a supervisor, that's something that I would see as an absolute positive, someone who can bring that to the table, an understanding of the system and how to best impact that system and influence that system. Beyond that, I think the powers of persuasion, being a good writer, a good researcher, a good communicator are so critical, in any position, but in particular in advocacy, being able to synthesize a complex topic in a way that a broad audience can digest is such an important skill. And not everyone has that from the get-go. It's certainly something you can gain and improve on and develop. But being able to really take a complex issue, synthesize it in a way that someone can digest, if it's a policymaker or a constituent that, a regular voter who you're trying to influence to then reach out to their policymaker, really being able to communicate these complex issues to a broader audience is so important. So I would say, that background knowledge base, if someone with a legal background has it, that's a plus. But beyond that, basic skills of writing, communicating, and just, again, having that enthusiasm and being able to just try something new. Aaron spoke to it too. Try something new and take something on, even though it might be brand new to you and you might not necessarily see how you can work your way around it, but at least trying to take a new project on goes a long way in terms of being nimble in this advocacy world.
Great. Let's see if there are any other questions from the audience. Yes, Nora.
Okay, only if no one else does, because I've already got my piece. And also, I realized I didn't say thank you. Thank you all so much. It's been really, really valuable. I also was curious about work-life balance in different kinds of immigration law. Giulia, you were talking about working 80 hours a week doing immigration law at a firm. Obviously, yeah, different kinds of work have different hours and different kind of like life commitment levels. And I was wondering if anyone who wanted to could comment on that.
Great, thank you. Who wants to go first?
I'll go first, since I feel that work-life balance really depends on where you are and what you're doing. There is no one thing across it. It also means different things to different people. I have a fairly active Twitter presence, which is probably understating it a little bit. And I have been known to tweet at 11:30 at night while in bed, trying to get to sleep. I'll be tweeting about substantive immigration policy. But I also don't check my email basically after 6 o'clock. And, I also know a lot of people who have children. It's a very different situation. A lot of people, especially during the times of COVID, when everyone's working from home, work-life balance is a little more delicate. If you're doing direct services, that also really changes what you're doing. If you're doing detained work or things where deadlines are rapid and the stakes are incredibly high, a lot of people struggle with work-life balance, and burnout is a real concern in this industry, especially under President Trump, where immigration lawyers are burning out at a higher rate than ever before, not because they don't love the work, but just because it's so difficult to deal with the overwhelming trends of everything that's happening and the changes that are occurring. So I think it really depends on who you are, what your home life is. I think it is a field that is harder for people with children, like almost all fields of the law. And it is something where you're going to have, it's really going to depend on what you're doing and what your personal organization, if you're working for a nonprofit, what their policies are. I'm very lucky that I work for an organization that has a generous, we don't want you to work on the weekends policy. That is not every organization.
It was certainly not my experience in the law firm setting that personal life was respected. And I'll leave it at that. It was challenging as a new mother. I became a mother while I was in the law firm, and my son was unseen and not necessarily as important as our clients, and that definitely impacted my happiness and working at the law firm. And that's why I made change and I was lucky enough to be able to make that change for me and my family. And I went into my own law firm and different structures that allowed me to work less. I can't say that. I want to be very clear to you all that law firm life and nonprofit advocacy life are not too dissimilar, except the pay. There is an expectation that for many nonprofits that you will work for the mission, and sometimes that means very long days. So I think it's important to be able to create structure for yourself, no matter what work environment you are in, and to make sure that you create the boundaries that you need to know yourself. It's similar to what Sarah was saying. Know yourself, know your personality, and create the boundaries that you need in order to avoid that burnout and to maintain self-care. And obviously the care for yourself and your family and those that you love. Work shouldn't be an ends to mean or whatever that is. It should fulfill you, but there's life beyond work.
Thank you, Jill. Giulia, would you like to add something before we leave?
Yeah, very quickly, I would add that as a supervisor and someone who does interviewing in terms of recruiting for new positions, I would certainly encourage folks, and even if you're doing an informational interview, to ask about work-life balance for a potential new employer or the working environment. We get that question all the time. And luckily, we can truthfully say, and I would hope that anyone will be truthful in their circumstances, that at JRS, we have a very strong work-life balance, but it comes from the top. It really needs to be something that leadership acknowledges in terms of the importance of making sure that staff do not get burned out and have enough time for themselves and their families. And that we build in, even during the workday, opportunities for staff to take some time off. And especially during this time of COVID, others have mentioned too, we found from our staff, we did a couple of surveys of our staff just to check in with folks to see how they are. And there was just so much more work that was being piled onto people. In addition to their regular day-to-day, there was so much more that had to be done to respond to COVID and to adjust and pivot programming and efforts to COVID, that we had to acknowledge that and give people extra time and space to make sure that they did not feel overwhelmed. So it's something that I think it's a great question, and something that you should certainly ask any future employer and keep front of mind as you go down your career path.
Thank you, Giulia. So we've reached the end of our session, and I want to thank our speakers for the luxury of listening to you and learning about your work, your trajectory, your insights. Thank you so much for joining us today. It's really been a delight, and I know that our audience appreciates it. I want to note to our audience that all of our speakers have shared their emails in the chat so that they're open for you to contact them with any questions you may have. And before we go, I just want to remind our audience that we will have the 5th and last module of our fall series on November 10. with a webinar on November 10 and a career path session on November 12 about business and human rights. That's all for today. Thank you again to our speakers, and thank you to our audience for joining us.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you so much.